I'm really excited to have this conversation today as we talk about building high-performing teams, operational rigor, and where AI is impacting recruiting today. Becky, welcome to the show.
I think that's an area that a lot of companies, if they really want to realize the investment of the money that they're making in the future of whether it's TA or something else, honing in on that manager development piece and getting people to really understand how their role is different, I think is going to be the key to getting folks there.
What is your biggest piece of advice for managers trying to lead through change that you just described?
Opening yourself up to the idea that we may need to iterate, and whether that's our workflow, our process, it could be system configuration. That's part of the process. I would challenge leaders to reframe the question from, are you using the tool, to what can we do to really optimize or get the team to a place where this tool is actually effective and it's serving its purpose, because there's probably some validity to a lot of the noise that you're hearing.
All right, what's up, everybody? Today on the show is Becky Fagan. Becky is a former attorney turned talent leader who's built and scaled RecOps organizations across companies like Moderna, Meta, Wayfair. She's most recently led global TA and recruiting innovation at Moderna, driving employer brand, early careers, AI-powered hiring initiatives. I'm really excited to have this conversation today as we talk about building high-performing teams, operational rigor, and where AI is impacting recruiting today. Becky, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
I'm thrilled to have you. Where are you based? What are you working on?
Based in Boston. You mentioned that I most recently led global TA programs, recruiting innovation at Moderna. A big part of that work is really the intersection between talent attraction, operations, and technology. So really looking at the full system of how we attract and grow talent. So since then, I've been spending a lot of time really digging into a topic and a question that came up a lot during that work, but honestly, like at every company I've ever worked at, which is how do we really get the most out of the investments that we're making in technology and now AI? So how do you get from the point of making that decision, implementing it, and then really driving value? So a lot of what I've been digging into recently is the role of managers. So how we think about how that role has changed and will continue to evolve, not just in how we adopt new ways of working, but really how you think about the overall ecosystem beyond just where AI and technology fits in the process and even beyond just individual adoption.
100%. I think we've got to think about how the entire organization adopts AI. And this is actually fundamentally why there are predictions in the rest of the whole venture world and B2B SaaS is that SaaS is about to be flipped on its head, because people are talking about even how organizations use AI, LLMs, token cost across the entire company, not just, hey, we've got an HR department business group that has 15 tools, sales and marketing's got another 20, products got another 20. We're thinking about AI in aggregate. And then when we think about the skills of using LLMs, different business groups use them in different ways when you think about prompt engineering and organizations leveraging MCPs. So how are you thinking about developing those skills with managers?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think we've had a lot of discussion about individual barriers of adoption, right? So think about psychological safety, the permission to fail, all of these other pieces. And the role of managing, regardless of the function that you're leading within, again, whether it's there or another function within a business, is always uniquely individual to the team that you're leading. And what makes recruiting particularly complex in that space is not only the individual experience of those recruiters. So think you've got two folks sitting next to each other that are doing the exact same job, and the way in which they're experiencing that change or their evolution in their way of working is very unique, right? So one person is leaning in, totally on board, excited about it. The other person is resisting. And honestly, both of those reactions are completely reasonable. And so for a manager, we now have to think about how do you develop this skill set to take your team from post-implementation. So think we're ending our old way of working, whether it's manual or a hybrid of manual and technology or all of these different pieces. And then there's this kind of future state, right? That's the goal. And that could be agentic. It could be, again, this blend of technology and AI and automation and all of this. And teams are stuck in this kind of limbo, right? It's this neutral zone where it's like, okay, we're not doing this anymore, but some people have made it across that threshold. Some people are resisting. And as a manager, it's a new skill set to look at that team in the aggregate and think about, how do I now lead this entire function? And that could be whether it's a massive global organization, or it could be a small startup where you're a team of 1 or 2 or 3. How do you take that team from point A to point B, understanding that the journey for each of those individual folks is going to be very different? And so I think that's an area that a lot of companies, if they really want to realize the investment of the money that they're making in the future of whether it's TA or something else, honing in on that manager development piece and getting people to really understand how their role is different, I think is going to be the key to getting folks there.
Totally. And when I think about what you just described, I think about AI adoption and the Gartner hype cycle, where we've got perhaps leadership at the very top, board, investors at the peak of inflated expectations. I keep running into HR leaders, maybe they're not working in bleeding edge technology companies, and they almost think AI is more advanced than it is. They're receiving direction from their board, their CEO, their executive meetings where the CEO is saying, hey, we're going to implement AI into all of our business groups. And the CHRO comes back to the team and says, okay, go to market, buy AI, implement it, try to build it. And there's a frustration point when you have to explain that the technology is actually still pretty nascent. Then I think about the employees who are back and forth between the trough of disillusionment and the plateau of productivity on any given workflow or day. There are days that I use AI where I'm humming along and I'm like, this is great. And then my chat will break, my codex will break, and I'll be back in the trough of disillusionment where I'm like, God, this sucks. AI sucks. I'm just going to brute force this or do it the old way. And when we think about hiring, recruiting still works when you do it analog. All you really need is a phone, an email, and some data enrichment, and regular recruiting still works. So that's the way I'm thinking about what you described in terms of what we know in the industry as the Gartner hype cycle. What are your thoughts there around that kind of back and forth between productivity and disillusionment?
Yeah, 100%. So think about that stage that you mentioned where I'm excited about something, I'm trying it. Ugh, I'm hitting a barrier. I'm frustrated. For recruiters, that journey is uniquely complex because think of all of the different stakeholders that we have, right? You've got hiring managers putting pressure on you. You've got candidates and you're concerned about candidate experience, right? And wanting to provide a good candidate experience to them. You've got leadership pressure that's coming top down. There is every incentive for you to do the path of least resistance. So think about one of those kind of key traits that you need as a leader. And this is part of this, not just change cycle, but transition cycle, right? For actually getting people past this stage of implementation. So think like the training is done, the office hours are happening, hypercare is over. We've done all of that. And you're in this stage that you just described, which is, okay, I know what I'm doing, right? Some days it feels good, some days it feels bad. And part of that is selling recruiters on the problem, right? And you could talk to 4 different recruiters and 2 of them say, my goal and my objective is to fill recs. You talk to another one and they're like, my goal is to fill recs with the best possible candidate who's going to drive impact at my company. And then you talk to another one and the goal is to fill recs with the best candidates and do it in the most efficient, cost-effective way possible. So depending on who you're talking to and the lens through which they're looking at this, there might not be a problem to solve, right? Because they're looking at it on an individual basis, which is we're all creatures of habit. Think about how many manual spreadsheets still exist outside of your CRM. And it's like, okay, if my way is more comfortable for me, right? And I'm fast, I don't have to go through this uncomfortable transition period of learning something new. It's very easy and it's understandable to think about why recruiters then revert to manual ways of working, which is why you have to really think about getting folks on board and helping them understand the larger role that recruiters play within an organization. And all of this is happening with the subtext of downsizing, right? Maybe there's already been layoffs within your company, or recruiters themselves have seen their peers laid off. And so you're trying to lead through this stage of incredible discomfort. And it's uncomfortable because all change is uncomfortable, right? And then you layer in time pressure that recruiters are dealing with, learning a new technology and all of these other pieces. So it really is being able to translate something that may or may not resonate with individual recruiters. And that's hard, right? As a leader, it's taking something like, you look at a lot of the ROI stats for a lot of the tools that are out there, and they're very impressive, right? You're like, oh my God, of course we should automate scheduling. Yeah, of course we should. But a lot of that data is going to speak to the board, right? It's going to speak to the CFO. It's going to speak to the leadership team. And then you're in this weird, uncomfortable stage as a manager where you're in a leadership meeting and they're like, so how's it going with the team? They're like, they're frustrated. It's slowing them down. And leaders are like, this is the way we're going. And you as a manager are kind of like, I get it. It's slow, but you got to do it. So I think we need to do better for our managers to really arm them with a lot of the tools that they need in order to navigate through this transition, because it's hard for them, it's hard for their teams, and they, in my opinion, just deserve more support during this period of time.
What you just said reminded me of educators who complain about curriculum teaching to the test versus teaching for the most robust learning.
Yeah.
What is your biggest piece of advice for managers trying to lead through change that you just described?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of different pieces to it. I think the first is this neutral zone. Right. So again, this post-implementation, pre-full adoption land, that's going to be different for every individual on your team. Right. Some people might be beyond that, and that could last for a really long period of time. I think back on a lot of teams that I've joined, right, that had tech in place already. And then I started to peel back the layers of the onion and start to evaluate ROI or think about, why is everybody complaining about this tool? I think it's great, right? I don't get it. So you might be in this neutral zone already. You might be in it now. And I suspect a lot of folks are. And it's never too late to right the ship and start to figure things out. And I think the first piece of advice that I have is really understanding that this journey is going to be different for everybody. And so the sooner that you can tap into what individual members of your team need from you as a manager in order to support them through this change, I think the better off that you'll be. There's this framework that I love by Gretchen Rubin. I don't know if you're familiar, the 4 tendencies. If you're not familiar, if folks don't know it, Google it. You can take a quiz and figure out what tendency you are, which I think is very insightful. But anyways, I love it as a management tool because it helps me understand what each of my team members need from me. But also, when you think about this transition period, it's about behavior and habits. And so understanding how folks react to change and how they just psychologically approach forming habits, I think will help you as a manager. But the other piece of that too is really look at the feedback that you're getting, which might be super critical, right? Again, you're going to have these super users and champions, which you need, right? And you need these kind of like tool ambassadors and AI ambassadors. You need those, but it's not going to be enough to get folks that are resistant on board. But open yourself up to listening to that feedback. And instead of looking at it like noise or complaining, and I know it's frustrating because you're getting pressure, right, from your leadership team. Again, this cycle of, how's it going? They don't like it. They don't want to use it. I'm having a hard time defending this tool. But open yourself up to really listening to this critical feedback, because the reality is, during any tech implementation, a sandbox environment is so different than real life. It's so different than folks interacting with the tool during time pressure with real candidates when they're balancing a heavy rec load and they're doing more with less, and all of these other pieces that make it super complex. So opening yourself up to the idea that we may need to iterate, and whether that's our workflow, our process, it could be system configuration, it could be any of those things. That's part of the process. And I think we leave a lot of opportunity on the table because in our one-on-ones or our team meetings, it turns into an event session. And it's like you're listening, but might not really be listening. And so I would challenge leaders that find themselves in those situations to, especially in a one-on-one where you have someone in a safer environment where they can feel psychologically safe to open up. But I would challenge yourself to reframe the question from, are you using the tool, to what can we do to really optimize or get the team to a place where this tool is actually effective and it's serving its purpose? Because there's probably some validity to a lot of the noise that you're hearing.
100%. When I think about the conversation deferring to tools, it's so common. People want to know what is the latest and greatest technology. It's almost like B2B SaaS has become a lifestyle purchase where it's like, what's your stack? And people in the recruiting or people operators can often think, hey, if I used a similar tool that I was using, I'll be using the tools that will help my career be where I want it to be in my next position, or I'll have experience with that specific tool. So often we see recruiter or HR job descriptions with specific tools listed. So a lot of the incentivization comes from tools. But the reality is the workflow of recruiting can be done manually. You can execute a great end-to-end recruiting process without AI. So it comes back to this, why are we doing this in the first place? Is it because the business wants us to, or is it because we actually need this? What are you seeing in the last 12 to 18 months around the maturation of tools and if process has actually shifted?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. The first is every company is so different, and a tool that works really well for one team might not work in the same way or meet the same objectives of another team. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important to understand kind of the full picture of the tech that you're investing in and the full picture of your tech stack that you have and what role each tool is playing for your team and your organization specifically. I think one of the things that we don't realize is you think about not just the initial tech investment, but the ongoing tech investment that you're making. And a big piece of that is how much engineering resources are required in-house to support that, right? So ongoing tech debt and configuration updates and feature releases, like all of these other things are going to vary. And so you have to be honest with yourself with what your internal infrastructure can support. But I think the other piece of that too is really understanding again your purpose and your objective for each of these things, because you go to any demo with any tool and you're like, this is amazing, right? Like this is, it would be stupid, right? Not to
they're demoing
invest.
From Figma.
They're so good, right? You're like, whoa, this is like, could be life-changing for us.
Yeah.
But I think taking a step back and really understanding again for your organization specifically, what is the purpose and the objective, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Every function is so unique. There are geographic nuances, there are organizational nuances, there are cultural nuances, and a tool that is optimized for high volume, highly skilled recruiting. So think like in the life sciences space, like manufacturing, right? That's something that can be captured with skills and keywords. But you think about like executive hiring, right? It's so nuanced.
Sure.
And the folks that are really skilled at identifying those candidates, they understand that nuance. And there may be a sourcing tool that could serve a purpose, right? So think about like passive pipeline building, right? Generating content to passive candidates is a great way to use something that could be AI generated or automated at the executive level. But that's not going to be the same use case for lower level, higher volume roles. And this is not groundbreaking stuff, right? This is where a lot of, again, that conversation around where AI fits in the process comes into play. But then you pull it back again and you really think about the state of your team and the development and the current state of the development of your management layer that's going to be responsible for not only making those decisions, but then driving that change within the organization. And again, that's where I think the biggest opportunity comes in.
One of the things I keep thinking about is how we see products come to market as an agent, as a coworker, as a assistant, as a helper personified. It gives me a little bit of the ick, especially when I see it that in a way that's overly gendered, that skews more female in the sense that we see AI labeled and branded as like a female name, where women have historically taken on a lot of the administrative roles in a company. That gives me a little bit of pause. But I also think about this idea in general of agents as coworkers. At what point does an agent start to look like an employee in terms of responsibility for what you're seeing?
I think it depends, right? And I think like what you're saying speaks to something that I think fundamentally we need to understand in terms of the role that AI or really any digital technology can play, which is at the end of the day, it's a computer. And the way in which you interact and direct a computer is completely different than a human. So while it may play the role of a human within your team, understanding kind of that background and how it works. The one thing I think about is so much of what we've talked about over the last 2 to 3 years, which is prompting, right? Getting better at prompts. And a big piece of that is understanding that how literal you need to be. But the big piece of that also is that at the end of the day, again, the relationship that the humans on your team have with agents that might be taking over an entire role or augmenting a portion of someone's responsibilities is highly individual. And then you think about the role again of that frontline manager is now going to be managing a team of humans and agents, which is super complex, right? And it's so different than anything that we've ever done before. And you don't need to be an expert at agents, and you don't need to be an expert at understanding digital infrastructure. But there's a certain, I would say, like layer of honesty we need to have here, which is this is like a totally different ball game. And we need to back up a little bit and really invest again in thinking about are our managers, and again, whether that's like a global, multi-layered organization that spans different geographies, or it's a team of 1, 2, or 3. We need to be really honest about how difficult that role is if you really want to get your team from, again, this idea of agents and automation and all of these other pieces to making it through this uncomfortable stage of fragmented adoption, or maybe some pieces are working, but other pieces are not. And at the end of the day, that's going to be how you get from announcing this big shift to actually realizing that big shift. And I think every company is at a different stage now, but I think the universal truth is like the human response to all of this is like not unique, but the skills that we need as managers to really understand the complexity of this new way of working, it can't be overstated.
It can't. And when we come out of our little HR pep rally and we look at what's happening with the rest of the business, every other business group also wants to claim AI transformation. If you go to a product conference, they're going to be talking about how product leaders are going to lead AI transformation across the company. If you go to a sales and marketing software conference, they're going to talk about how sales and marketing is going to lead the digital transformation of AI across the company. Everybody wants to claim it because it's the highest leverage piece of work to be done. The problem with HR claiming that they are going to be the owners of AI transformation is like they've got a lot of projects left unfinished. They started a few years back with pay equity and pay transparency. I would say that's largely left unfinished. They started with DEIB. That is largely left unfinished. We talked a lot about L&D. I would say we haven't seen much from L&D in one glaringly obvious way. There's no actual HR mentorship organization that has meaningful, innovative learning for other practitioners. So if we can't even do this at our pep rally, at our conferences with our network, how are we going to do this and scale this within the organization? And then the fourth, I would say, ties a little bit into DEIB is representation. We don't actually see strong enough representation from marginalized groups in tech. So I think about these 4 massive projects that HR hasn't finished, and now they want to go do the AI. How do you think HR can be more strategic in doing great?
So each of those initiatives that you just mentioned are transitions, right? in and of themselves within organizations. And so as a leader, depending on how complex your portfolio is or your roadmap is or your priority list, you could have 4 work streams all sitting in this neutral zone simultaneously. You probably do. And so I think a big piece of that is it's not an either or, and it doesn't necessarily need to be an either or. It can be a yes and. But I think, again, it goes back to this needing to really flex this muscle of understanding transition and how managing through a transition is much different than managing through a change. And for the most part, some organizations better than others do a fairly good job of managing change. So you think about it could be something that's announced at a team meeting, it's a new initiative, it's a message communication that gets cascaded throughout the teams, and then everyone's whatever happened with, weren't we doing that thing? Whatever happened with that? And that's the neutral zone, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And so I think before or simultaneously with taking on this next stage of transformation or innovation, because the tech transformation, it's happening, right? And the pressure that we get from leadership is very real. And I understand that. And that doesn't make it right or wrong. And sometimes the timing of some of these directives might not be optimal, again, because you might have a number of initiatives that are still ongoing. And so I think it goes back to not only just having good prioritization that is established and aligned on with your leadership team and your executive team, like obviously you need to do that. But I think for a lot of us, we know that it is a yes and, right? And we're not looking to necessarily take things off of our plate because there's a lot of things that were important. They still are important. Some things are compliance and legal, and you don't have a choice. You have to do them as an HR organization. And so understanding where each of these different initiatives are at this kind of spectrum of transition, I think will help you start to understand what levers need to be pulled and where perhaps you might have dropped the ball on something. There's so many frameworks out there in terms of the evolution of change and how you lead through these changes. And so I think just being honest with yourself about, okay, this is hard, but like it's supposed to be hard. And if you thought that post rollout, something was just magically going to happen, like it's not, right? And that's, again, this stage in this uncomfortable area where a lot of leaders find themselves now where I don't understand, why didn't this catch on? And so your work isn't done yet. And it's okay if you're now in the transition of tech and AI and trying to really innovate the way that you work alongside some of those initiatives that were important and they are important, and you don't want to deprioritize them. You don't want to get rid of them, but it's a good time to actually be honest with yourself about the work that's ahead and how you lead your entire organization, whether it's 200 or 2 people, from point A to point B.
That's where I go back to the cost piece you mentioned earlier. That's so important. It's what is the cost of doing this? Does this make sense? If good management is running the financial operations of a business group, does it make sense to bet the farm on a new tool or vibe coding your own workflow? At the end of the day, practitioners in an HR department, they buy vendor tools, and those vendors often offer indemnity. And in hiring, there is much regulation that doesn't exist in other areas of the business where maybe those business leaders in sales and marketing or product are implementing AI faster. In hiring, things can go pretty awry, especially for an early stage company if they get hit with a lawsuit from the EEOC. So I think a little bit of caution, a little bit of discernment when it comes to moving quickly to vibe code things is critical, because you also want to look at the cost savings. HR tech is relatively cheap compared to those other business groups' technologies. Even though the software itself looks the same in sales and marketing as it does in recruiting, in sales and marketing, it can often cost 10 times the cost for a very similar product. And when I think about building internal tools, you always want to have a 3 to 5x ROI on that cost savings against the tool you're replacing for the reasons you mentioned when it comes to building and maintaining and engineering tools needed to keep that internal tool running. One of the challenges we're seeing around evaluating the cost of internal tools is token cost is largely subsidized right now. So token cost could increase in the next few years, replacing some part of the workflow and claiming that you saved 10, 15, 20, $50,000. That's actually not that much for software. So I don't think it's this traditional signal HRs have relied on of, hey, I saved the company money as proving their value. How do you think about building versus buying?
I think it depends. And I think a big piece of it, again, is understanding the stage that you all are at and the realities of that. And this is coming from Meta. I was at Meta for 3 years and everything was homegrown. And the tools there, don't come at me. I know some folks had mixed feelings. In my opinion, they were so good, right? Because they were built for us and we had limitless resources at that time, right? To build things that really spoke to everything that you would want and need. I've also worked at organizations with smaller budgets that were scrappier, right? I think about data systems, for example. I've worked in beautiful dashboarding tools, and I've also pulled messy Workday reports, dumped it in Excel, and taught myself how to do a VLOOKUP because I'm like, how do I find this? How do I map this to this? And kind of you like scotch tape it. You've got a couple Band-Aids, and you're like, all right, that's good enough. It looks okay. And so I think that not modeling the decisions that you make in terms of tech investments off of what you hear is effective at other organizations, I think is really important. And as a leader and as a recruiting practitioner, we gain so much from our community, from talking to peers, from conferences, for roundtable discussions, from podcasts, right? From industry leaders and thought partners and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, you really need to understand and have a baseline understanding of where your organization is and what you're trying to solve for before you make any sort of investment. And so that starts with just having a very basic data infrastructure. It doesn't need to be overbuilt, but getting a sense of some baseline metrics that you believe a tool could move the needle on, and whether it's helping you hire better, faster, all of these things that we're trying to do and we're trying to really objectively measure. But before you have any of that in place, I wouldn't make any investment decisions, right? Because what will happen and what I've experienced myself is could be year post-implementation of something, and whether it's a homegrown tool or it's an off-the-shelf solution, and what do we want to do again? Everyone's complaining about this. I feel like there's a better way to do it. And then you try and reverse engineer ROI and how you were trying to originally think about what this tool is going to solve for. And again, you're doing this amidst all of this human discomfort, right? Because everyone's sitting here again in this area of mixed adoption and all of that. And so I think it's being really honest with yourself about the realities of your organization, the realities of the support that you'll receive in-house, the support that a third-party vendor could provide for you, and looking at that entire ecosystem. And if you've already invested in stuff, and whether it's a mix of homegrown, off the shelf, anywhere in between, it's not too late to be like, okay, we need to figure this out, because it could be expensive, not just from a cost perspective, but from a resource perspective. It could be expensive from a transition management perspective. And until you get your house in order on that, in that regard, you don't want to be making an additional investments or really pushing more tools on top of that.
Yeah, and I love that you called out specifically, don't just do something because you see somebody else doing something for their organization. And that can be really challenging, especially in the world we live in now, where a lot of recruiters are trying to keep up. A lot of recruiters have been displaced. People are trying to have the skills to get them their next job that's going to pay their bills, support their family. I get it. Recruiting has been through the ringer. I love that you mentioned Facebook and having internal tools and having tons of resources. It also comes down to appetite for risk from the company.
100%.
that you're representing. And I would say Facebook has one of the highest appetites for risk. What was their early motto?
Move fast and break things.
That's like
Switch to move fast with stable infrastructure.
Move fast with stable infrastructure. I love it. I love it. Let's be discerning in HR and remember that one of the scariest 4-letter words for a recruiter is EEOC. So I think it's important that we build right size for the right organization. This is actually teeing myself up. Screw it. I'll just say there's a lot of hot takes. People love to bash on legacy ATS systems. Yeah. I actually have a theory. You don't want your ATS to be that good. If your ATS and your applicant experience is the best technology your employee touches, it's actually not setting them up for success, and you're hiding the ball on what it's like to work there. So if your operating stack at your company in whatever industry is legacy, you might not want the shiniest ATS on the block. Sure, you're going to get candidates in the funnel, but no, the ATS should not be the fanciest, easiest, smoothest, best UI in your tech stack. And that's one of my weirdest takes I have going.
And I think it's interesting because I think it goes back to, again, particularly if you're a new leader joining an organization, and we all have our comfort technologies, right? Oh, we're using Workday. Workday's our ATS. But but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, right?
Hot take. I love Workday.
I
love Workday.
But think about, though, again, this what is its purpose, right? Which is exactly your point. And now even basic ATSs have AI add-ons and co-pilot features and all of these other things. And all of that takes more resources, right, from an engineering perspective. And then it starts to get slow and it starts to get kind of clunky. And then wait, how many steps am I taking in this system? And I could send a scheduling invite for a recruiter screen from this system, or I could do it manually. I always go back to this example because I'm survey your team. I guarantee everybody is doing it differently, right? Yep. Because again, you all have your ways of working and your habits and all of that. But it goes back to, again, understanding what does this specific tool do? And are you getting too far away from the singular purpose that you've invested in this specific technology for? And again, it's easy to come into things because you might have a preconceived notion from another organization that you led that had a different tech stack. But the reality of that team is so different, right? So different than the team that you're in. So I know when I found myself recommending that we use Workday recruiting as our primary ATS in a previous role, I was like, I kind of can't believe I'm saying this. But for where we're at, and where we have money and the future that we want to go, I think our AI investments are actually better spent in another area as opposed to how we're thinking about where we're tracking our applicants.
Yep. Let's go. Not all opinions are created equal. Not everybody who has a hot take against whatever tool because they didn't like their candidate experience for a job they didn't get in 2021 or whatever matters.
He's going deep now.
The people hating on Workday are just so far removed from this strategic layer of implementing Workday in the first place or understanding the strategy of why it would be implemented. So yeah, I'm team Workday. Go get you some Workday because at the end of the day, a great recruiter knows if they've used Workday, a lot of the times you're making submits on behalf of the candidate. Sure, you're dealing with high volumes of individual contributors, but the strategic hires are often submits. And oftentimes a recruiter is putting a candidate through anyway. This is where the ATS reverts to system of record and not necessarily employer brand and recruitment marketing inbound application capture. So we're aligned, Team Workday. You didn't ask me my emotional support piece of technology, and it's my Smeg coffee maker. I get jacked up on defending Workday, so thank you for letting me
we
rant.
love that. We love that.
Okay, so if you were stepping into a head of TA role today, blank slate, what are you doing?
Yeah. And I think there's all of those things that you need to do, right? Your due diligence, your kind of understand and identify exercises before you do anything. But I think the most important thing for any leader is understanding that recruiting is not done in a vacuum, right? And so everything that you build around that, whether it's your processes, your assessments, the way in which you move candidates through the funnel, it is the first step in the employee life cycle. And so being able to build systems that connect those dots from day one or day whatever, if you're stepping into something that's pre-existing, I think is the only way that you can do it for the future. Because I think historically, I think about some of the past roles that I've had, it's recruiting is like a faucet that didn't turn off. And then you're trying to clean up processes and things like that on top of it. And so I think acknowledging that it's not just adding headcount, it's adding the right people at the right time for the stage that you're at, and then setting it up to really be able to connect those dots. So it's, again, that data infrastructure piece, not overbuilding, but getting some good basic systems in place early. And then the other piece of that, too, is I think building from a mindset of talent attraction as opposed to reactive recruiting. And I think that's where a lot of processes break down. I think it's where a lot of this adoption challenge comes into play is not only are we reactive, but we are programmed to do whatever it takes to fill a rec. And I think that's challenging, right? And it's complex. And so building systems early on that take that entire ecosystem into account to think about our intent is talent attraction, right? And that could take the form of having an employer branding strategy, an outbound sourcing strategy, optimizing inbound flow and referrals. But it's all of those different pieces because at the end of the day, the most important thing that we do as recruiters is protecting hiring quality and protecting a culture as a company scales, right? And that's whether you're 50 employees, 100 employees, or 1,000 employees plus.
Yeah, I love that. I just got back from Fish Show at the Sphere, and a famous fish entrance to one of their festivals was, "Our intent is for your delight." I think our intent for candidate delight should be huge. It should be top of mind talent attraction, not just post and pray. Inbound applications, we're optimizing for a 0.5, maybe 1% conversion rate anyway. So that's why we need a really strong talent attraction strategy. So we're getting the best possible 0.5% applicants inbound while your recruiters are out there sourcing and getting those direct hires from people they go out and find. We all know referrals, often best source of hire, sourced, top source of hire. You're getting lucky if you're getting somebody cold inbound. We've all been there where we make a great hire inbound, but I'm not betting the farm on inbound. So talent attraction is the future. It's what everybody should be focusing on. I want to get us out of here on time, Becky. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people stay up to date with what you're up to and where you're publishing?
Yeah, definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm posting, I'm sharing. So that's the best way.
Amazing. Thanks for coming on the show. This was an
Thank
absolute
you for
blast.
having me.